Welcome to Down the Dopamine Hole, where random subjects are forced to hold hands until they get along and then tied together with a psychological concept. My name is Dr. Amy Guertin. Amy's fine. About a week ago, I was having a conversation with my cat, and anyone that knows me knows that that is not unusual in the least. I have a cat that is afraid of everything, and I had turned the ceiling fan on, and of course, my cat's afraid of the ceiling fan. Every time she looked up and saw the ceiling fan, she would crouch down in fear. After she had done this pretty much all day, I finally looked at her and I said, 13, it's my cat's name because she's a black cat. So I said, 13, chill out. There is no need for the fight or flight. I've had you since you were 5 weeks old. You have not had trauma. And then I stopped and said, unless me bringing you into my house at 5 weeks old was the trauma. And then I thought for a second, I said, oh my God, maybe you don't actually love me. Maybe it's just Stockholm syndrome. And that is how the subject for this episode came to be. In August of 1973, an escaped convict named Jan Erik Olsson went into a bank in Stockholm, Sweden, and he fired a submachine gun into the ceiling. He then took 4 bank employees hostage, and he demanded that another convict be released. He demanded money, and he demanded an escape vehicle, and he demanded a getaway car. Within hours, all of his demands were met by Swedish police. However, he wanted to take the hostages with him to ensure that he had a quick getaway. And 5-0 was like, nope. And that set off a 6-day hostage situation, which you would think would be a really traumatic experience. But for these hostages, it wasn't. And the reason for that was because both of their captors, but especially their original captor, Olsson, was really nice to them. They were allowed to call their families and let their families know that they were okay. And when one of the hostages couldn't get through to her family, because, we didn't have like call waiting in the 70s, like when you called, you didn't get notified that there was another call coming through, so you could click over. She got really upset. He told her not to give up and to keep trying, that she would get through eventually. When another woman was cold, he gave her his jacket. He kept everybody in the bank vault. And when one of the women got claustrophobic, he actually put her on a 30-foot rope so that she could walk outside of the bank vault. The hostages got to be on a first-name basis with their captors. And they got to the point where they feared the police because they knew that the longer the captivity went on, the more likely it was that the police were going to do something dramatic, which put their lives at danger. After 6 days, the police pumped tear gas into the bank vault, and the captors surrendered. The police told the hostages to come out first, but they refused because they said that if they came out first, the police were going to shoot and kill the captors, and they didn't want that to happen. So they refused to come out until the captors were arrested safely, and that's exactly what happened. One of the hostages saw a psychiatrist after the fact and said, "Is there something wrong with me? Why don't I hate them?" Within months, psychiatrists came up with a name for the emotional indebtedness that these hostages felt toward their captors, and they called it Stockholm syndrome. You think about that, your first thought might be emotional indebtedness? Like, what? They just held these people hostage for 6 days. Where does the emotional indebtedness come in? But let's think about a few things that happened here. The captors had the ability to treat the hostages in any way that they chose, but they chose to treat them kindly. The hostages got to know the captors as people, as individuals, rather than just as a stereotype of escaped cons who hold people as hostage. And we know that direct contact is one of the most effective ways of decreasing prejudice. The longer the siege went on, the more possibility that the police were going to do something dramatic, which could endanger their lives. However, the hostages knew that as long as they were with the captors, they were safe. So they got to look at the captors as the safe people and the police as the dangerous people. The captors kept them safe. The captors could have done anything to them. and they didn't. So yeah, it's kind of easy to see where there could be some emotional indebtedness there. One of the most famous cases of Stockholm Syndrome was Patty Hearst. In February of 1974 in California, Patty Hearst was kidnapped from her apartment, and she was held ransom by the Symbionese Liberation Army, or the SLA, because I'm not saying Symbionese Liberation Army a bunch of times, which was a small leftist organization. And Patty Hearst's father, Randolph Hearst, was a wealthy newspaper man. They said that they would let her go if he would donate $2 million of food for impoverished Californians, which he did. They still held her and said that they wanted him to donate another $4 million in food, which he said he would if his daughter would be released unharmed. And she wasn't released. A month later, she made a video of her own volition stating that she was voluntarily joining the SLA. And over the next 6 months, she traveled with the SLA all over the country, engaging in armed robberies with them. She was eventually caught by the police, and she was sentenced to 7 years in prison, but her sentence was commuted after 4.5 years, and she was fully pardoned in 2001. In 1933, 25-year-old Mary McElroy was taking a bath when 4 men broke into her house. They intended to kidnap her for ransom, but when they found out that she was taking a bath, they let her get dressed before they took her. They took her to a farmhouse where they chained her to a wall in the basement. They treated her kindly. They did not harm her. They held her for ransom for 2 days. When the ransom was paid, they released her. When the men were convicted, Mary begged the governor to reverse their sentences, and she visited the men throughout their incarceration. 7 years later, she committed suicide. And in the note that she left, she stated, "My 4 kidnappers are probably the 4 people on earth who don't consider me an utter fool." In March of 1998, 10-year-old Natascha Kampusch was abducted and kept for 8 years by a man who repeatedly beat and raped her. She was kept in a concrete cellar, but eventually was let into other parts of the house. When she was 18, she was able to escape because she was cleaning out her captor's car when he got distracted by a phone call. Once he realized she was gone, her captor committed suicide before he could be caught. When Natascha found out that he had died, she cried inconsolably, and she lit a candle for him at a morgue. For years, she carried a picture of him, and she ended up buying the house that she was held captive in, and she visits it regularly. There's a lot of debate as to whether or not Stockholm Syndrome is an actual valid syndrome. It's not in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. The DSM is the book that has the diagnostic criteria for all of the psychological disorders that we diagnose. The reason that it's not in the DSM is because there is no agreed upon criteria for what makes up Stockholm Syndrome. There is no empirical research base for Stockholm Syndrome. The term was invented by the media. It was not invented by the psychological community. So there's debate over the definition, there's debate over the criteria, the resulting symptoms. A meta-analysis of 12 studies determined that Stockholm Syndrome has 4 common symptoms: direct threats of harm, victims are kept in isolation, in close confines to the captor, and or physically restrained. Victims have an opportunity to escape, but they fail to use it. And victims show sympathy with their captors post-captivity. There was a study by the FBI that had some differences in their criteria of Stockholm Syndrome. They said that in order for Stockholm Syndrome to happen, the situation has to last for several days or longer. The hostage takers have to remain in contact with the hostages. Hostage takers show some kindness toward the hostages, or at least refrain from harming them. In a lot of the kidnapping victims that we've seen, in which men tend to kidnap women or kidnap female children, they're absolutely harmed. Another FBI paper specifically states that if a victim of captivity witnesses or experiences physical or psychological abuse, that Stockholm syndrome is extremely unlikely to occur. And if it does start to occur, a victim who experiences or witnesses that type of harm, the Stockholm syndrome is likely to stop. Very, very different in what we've seen in people who have been said to suffer from Stockholm syndrome. In the 1990s, researchers actually began to understand that it wasn't just victims of hostage situations that showed signs of Stockholm syndrome. Those in domestic violence relationships, hostages who had been abused, kidnapped victims, concentration camp survivors, prisoners of war, cult members, prostitutes, incest victims, children who have been abused, and later, sex traffic workers. All of these people have been shown to have symptoms of what was once considered Stockholm syndrome. There have been other explanations that have been given for once was thought of as Stockholm syndrome. And these explanations tend to be better explanations. One of them is trauma bonding. Trauma bonding happens more in one-on-one situations in which there is some type of intimacy, regardless of whether the intimacy is consensual. This is most common in domestic violence relationships or in kidnapping relationships where women or female children are kidnapped by a man. Emotional bonding is a survival mechanism. Developing an emotional bond with the captor allows the victim to better predict the moods and the behaviors of the abuser, which allows them to put their abuser's needs first. It also makes them see any potential rescuer, whether it is family and friends, whether it's the police. It forces them to see those people as the enemy because the only one who can stop the abuse is the captor. Victims know that the most dangerous time for them is either during a rescue or when they leave. So when they have people like friends and family telling them you need to leave, it's pretty much the same as having somebody tell them you need to put your life at a bigger risk than what it is right now. And they tend to then start to see that person more negatively. Another explanation I think that happens in both one-on-one relationships as well as in more what we think of as traditional hostage relationships is appeasement. When we're faced with a threat, we tend to go into that fight or flight response, or to be more accurate, fight, flight, fawn, or freeze. None of these are good survival methods for long-term captivity. So there needs to be an alternative. And appeasement is that alternative. Appeasement essentially is a polyvagal response. So it is an automatic neural response that happens in the brain that allows you to use mixed strategies as opposed to just fight, flight, fawn, or freeze. It essentially allows you to use hypervigilance, which would be a fight or flight response, but also a lack of aggression, which would be the response of fawn or freeze. But it allows you to use those together. It allows you to use that hypervigilance to be able to pay attention to what your captors are doing and to learn to predict their moods and their behavior, but also a lack of aggression so that you're not becoming combative. And one of the ways that we do this is we do this through social interaction. We become social, our behavior becomes intentional instead of just defensive. It's been shown to be a very, very good survival mechanism. It allows hostages to use social engagement to appear harmless and to appear obedient. It allows hostages to look calm. It allows them to not shut down. Appeasement helps captives to self-regulate their emotions. It allows them to self-regulate their behaviors. It allows them to not engage in purely defensive activities like yelling or fighting, and it allows them to replace them with intentional strategies like social interaction. It allows them to be in close proximity to a captor with the least likelihood of injury. Even though there isn't an agreed upon definition or criteria for Stockholm Syndrome, and there's not enough research to warrant its addition to the DSM, the term and concept still exist in the psychological community, law enforcement, and in the general public. This made me think of another concept, which is midlife crisis. Before you think, well, that's a pretty random jump in subject, it's not as random as you think. So buckle up, enjoy the ride, follow me, I'll take you there. Midlife crisis is defined as a period of unhappiness and self-doubt, often occurring between ages 35 and 65, which is triggered by aging, mortality, and unmet life goals. Like 35? Damn, that's harsh. That's really harsh. Sorry if you're 35. It implies a rapid and substantial change in personality. There's a lot of research that's regarding midlife crisis, and I'm going to tell you what some of the research says. Some of the research has found the following: increases in depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, and suicide rates, substance use and dependence, concentration and memory problems, headaches, sleep issues, and high job stress. However, I always tell you that there's a however in these things. However, when we actually do, research on larger groups of people and men and women, it's only been found that about 10 to 20% of people actually experience a midlife crisis. And of those that do experience a midlife crisis, only 5 to 10% of that, so only half of that, actually has anything to do with age. So when we think of midlife crisis, or when, the average public thinks of midlife crisis, we think, oh my God, everybody experiences it, and it's when you turn 40 and you realize you're going to die and you're old. Absolutely not. That is not what happens, okay? There is slightly more unhappiness that is shown over and over in research during midlife, but this has only been shown in what's called cross-sectional research. Cross-sectional research is when we study different age groups at the same time. So if I were to study 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds, 50-year-olds, 60-year-olds, 70-year-olds at the same time, the problem with that is that I'm talking about different generations at the same period of time. That's not going to necessarily be the most accurate way to study happiness across the lifetime. So when they've actually done longitudinal research, which means that they take a group of people starting at 30 and they follow them through midlife, what they actually find is a really different story. What they actually find is that well-being is actually stable through midlife. There are certain things that tend to happen more commonly during midlife than at any other stage of development. And these things can be some of the reasons why there are more issues or more problems with things like stress, depression during midlife. That has nothing to do with age. There are multiple role demands that happen during midlife. You have what is called the sandwich generation, which means that you have people in middle adulthood that are taking care of not only their children, but they're also taking care of their parents. And that is something that you're not going to see in other parts of life. You have financial stresses that don't exist in other parts of life. Teenagers are expensive. Then you have young adults that are going into college. And frequently then you have, again, dealing with parents who may need additional care, which is expensive. And you're also dealing with your own retirement. Children tend to live with parents longer than they used to. You now have to deal with having an adult live with you and trying to negotiate what it's like to live with an adult. Some middle adults have more responsibility for their grandchildren because of the cost of daycare. More people get divorced during midlife than at any other time. And 65% of divorces are initiated by women. A lot of people will wait until their children are out of the house to get divorced. For women, it often takes until midlife for them to be financially independent enough to actually get divorced. And if you think about it, the average lifespan is about 80. So it's very common for people to lose a parent during midlife, which can be an extremely emotionally devastating event. If you think about it, if any of these things were to happen at any age, it would cause an increase in emotional issues and a decrease in well being. Overall, what research has come up with is that midlife crisis has more to do with having a neurotic personality than it does with age. More recent research shows that the majority of middle aged adults are satisfied with their lives, and they either stay that way or their life satisfaction increases over a 10-year period. Most people are at the peak of their job success and they're making more money than they've ever made. Self confidence is at its highest. Although cognitive processing speed may not be as high as it was in young adulthood, our crystallized intelligence, or how much we know, is higher than it's ever been. Although I may not process information quite as quickly as I did when I was 25, what I know compared to when I was 25 is pretty astronomical. So I'm still going to be able to come up with information much more quickly than I did when I was 25, just because there's more of it. People have a better quality of life in midlife, mostly because they have more money. They have access to more consistent and higher quality health care, more access to leisure activities. They have fewer negative events and chronic strains. They have more social, financial, and psychological resources. Couples can focus more on themselves now because their kids tend to be grown. Both in young adulthood and middle adulthood, people are really optimistic about the future. So this whole, oh my God, I'm going to die because I'm old, that's not really the case. Why do we continue to believe in things that aren't true, or at least that we can't prove are true? And there's a lot of reasons, but lack of access to correct information is not one of them. Because we all have the interwebs, we all have the Googs. But realistically, there are so many decisions that we make on a day-to-day basis. We don't all have the time or the energy. And some people don't know how to actually go find correct information. And I'm just going to give you a fraction of the reasons of why we believe things that aren't true, but here's just a few. One thing is called the illusory truth. And the illusory truth basically says that if information is encountered multiple times, we tend to believe it. We only use 10% of our brain. I'm sure we've all heard that. I don't know how many times. It's not true. I mean, you guys might use 10% of your brain. I use all of it. We know even in the simplest of things that you do, you use your entire brain. There's something that's called confirmation bias, which says that if we have a belief, we tend to look for information that's going to confirm that belief, and then we tend to ignore information that does not confirm that belief. If I have a belief that people with mental health issues are violent, I'm going to look for things that are actually going to prove that. I'm going to look for somebody who went and, I don't know, committed a violent crime. And then if I read in that article that they also were diagnosed with some disorder, I'm going to be like, see? In reality, that's not true, by the way. Just to give you like quick statistic, 3 to 5% of violent crimes are committed by people with mental illness, which means that 95 to 97% of all violent crimes are committed by people that do not have mental health conditions. You have to look at the information source. This is another reason why we tend to believe things that aren't true. We tend to look for information from sources that tend to mirror our beliefs rather than from sources that actually have the most neutral, correct, accurate information. If I'm staunchly conservative, I'm going to go to very conservative sources to get my news. If I am staunchly liberal, I'm going to go to staunchly liberal sources to get my news. But we very often trust or mistrust the information based on the source. Another reason why we tend to believe things that aren't true is the emotionality of the information. Emotional information tends to be believed more readily, especially if it's based on fear. That's what every commercial in the world does. It says, here's a problem that you didn't know you had. Isn't that horrible and terrifying? Here's the solution to the problem. Emotional language, it can help us to focus on information that's important, but it can also take our focus away from information that's very important. That can be a double-edged sword. This is very bad of me, I will admit. I was in class one day teaching, and I had a student of mine say, who was, I don't know, in his 30s. He had a child that was somewhere around 10. We were talking about ADHD, I believe, and he said, I don't believe in giving my kid medication. Apparently, that was a day when whatever went through my head came out of my mouth with there being no, hesitation. And I looked at him and said, well, I don't believe in good parents making their kids suffer. And as soon as it came out, I went, oh, this is going to be so bad. I know that there's going to be a conversation after class, and he's not going to be wrong. But the funny thing was, is actually after class, he came up to me and said, thank you for saying that. I never thought about it as my kid suffering. And I said, oh, yeah, he's absolutely suffering. And he asked me for a referral, and I gave him one. Emotionality can work very well. Another reason why we tend to believe things that aren't true is our own emotions. We use our feelings to tell us if something is right or wrong. And normally, I completely agree with that. However, people who make decisions based entirely on their emotions can make some really bad decisions. So you have to remember that feelings are temporary. How you respond to information one day may not be how you respond to the same information on another day. If you have somebody, like, example, this is hopeless, there's no reason to even try, that's how people become suicidal. Whereas that isn't necessarily how you're going to feel on another day. Humans like to think of themselves as rational and deliberate, but in reality, we're lazy thinkers. And this plays directly into why psychological myths are so easy to believe and they're so hard to change. We gravitate toward explanations that are simple and that are familiar and that are emotionally satisfying, even if they're not true. Myths like opposite attract or people are strictly left-brained or right-brained, they stick around not because they're true, but because they're easy to understand and they're easy to remember. They give us a neat, tidy story without requiring us to dig into messy scientific evidence. Once we hear these ideas repeated enough, our brain starts to treat them as facts, relying on familiarity as a shortcut to truth. However, mental shortcuts make us more vulnerable to biases, and those biases reinforce these myths. We tend to notice and remember examples that seem to confirm what we already believe while ignoring evidence that contradicts it. If someone believes a myth about personality or behavior, they'll likely interpret everyday experiences in ways that prove it, even when those interpretations are flawed. Because careful, critical thinking takes effort. And we don't always stop to question where a belief comes from or whether it's supported by reliable research. As a result, psychological myths persist, not because people are incapable of understanding the truth, but because our brains are wired to prefer the easiest explanation over the most accurate one. Be careful of being a lazy thinker. It makes you gullible. If you're going to believe everything that you read or hear, I have some gold I'd like to sell you at a really good price. That's all I have for today. Thank you so much for spending your valuable time with me. My goal is to put out content every Sunday. If you liked what you saw or listened to, click on all of the buttons. Just, punch them, do something. I know you can do it. I have faith in you. Feel free to like or comment. Love comments. It makes me think that you are actually paying attention. If you're interested in any of the research for this podcast, it can be found below or on the corresponding website, downthedopaminehole.com. I hope you learned something new, and I hope you enjoyed your time with me. Be safe, take care of yourself, be happy, but most importantly, keep it weird.